This video is an explanation of the reading comprehension passage about the Eighth Symphony. This could be watched in conjunction with any question about the passage, and of course each question is explained in its own video explanation. I will point out that if you're doing several questions about this passage, I'd recommend not watching this video until you answer all the questions, so that you're answering the questions with your own understanding of the passage. So let's talk about this passage. It's not too long, but it's very complicated. The Seventh Symphony, 1812, was at the time Beethoven's last and vibrant word on the big style he had cultivated in the previous decade. In the Eighth Symphony, 1814, he does something new by seeming to return to something old. Very interesting. Seeming to turn to something old. He writes that is a symphony shorter than any since his first. So he had had all these larger and larger symphonies. Apparently from the first through the seventh, the symphonies had been getting bigger and bigger, and suddenly he writes one that is smaller. So he's seeming to return to something old, but that's very important. It's not that he's actually returning to something old. Then we get this other interesting statement. It is almost as though he wanted to call his entire development through that decade into question. Almost as though. So here we're getting a kind of figure of speech, a kind of analogy. It's not that he actually wanted to call his previous development into question. It's not that he was saying, that Beethoven was actually saying, making the symphonies bigger and bigger was a bad idea. It was just that he had been pursuing one path, and then for whatever reason, he decided to pursue this very different direction. Instead of making the symphonies bigger, he wrote one that was smaller. And then we just get this comment, indeed, over the remaining years of his life, he would confidently explore in opposite directions, writing bigger pieces than before and ones more compressed, his most rhetorical music and his most inward, his most public and his most esoteric, compositions that plumbed the inexhaustible possibilities of the sonata style, and those that propose utterly new ways of organizing material, musics reaching the extreme of the centered and the bizarre. So in other words, he's just pointing out the tremendous variety in the ways that he's approaching things in his later years. And so the fact that he switches directions, again, it's not that he's saying that making the symphonies bigger was a wrong idea. He's just going in a new direction. If, however, we think of the Eighth Symphony as a nostalgic return to the good old days, we misunderstand it. A really important statement there. To say that it is 1795 revisited from the vantage point of 1812 is not right either. So in other words, it's not that he's going back. He's doing something new and different, even though this symphony is shorter, like some of the earlier symphonies. It doesn't resemble the earlier symphonies in other ways, other than the fact that it's a shorter symphony. It's not following the pattern of getting longer and longer. What interests Beethoven is not so much brevity for its own sake, and certainly not something called classicism, as concentration. That might be one of the most important sentences in the whole passage right there. So we don't know what classicism is, but it seems to have something to do with brevity, for having works that were short, works on a smaller scale. And that's not what is of interest to Beethoven, just writing something short for the sake of being short. What interests him is concentration. Now, what do we mean by this? It is as though he were picking up from where he left off in the densely saturated first movement of the Fifth Symphony to produce another tour de force of tight packing. So in other words, concentration, densely saturated, tightly packing. So in other words, there's a lot of, we could say a lot of emotion or a lot of energy or a lot of musical ideas that are concentrated into this work. And so certainly it's true in the first movement of the Fifth Symphony. He had already done something like this 2 years earlier in one of his most uncompromising works, the F minor string quartet opus 95. And so in other words, this idea of concentration, he used this in the first movement of the Fifth Symphony. He used it again in the string quartet. But now he's going to use it in a whole symphony, and this is what the Eighth Symphony is about. A symphony is not a private connoisseur's is not a private connoisseur's music like a string quartet. By comparison, the Eighth Symphony is the Opus 95's friendly, open-featured cousin. So it still is a very concentrated work. It's not as uncompromising as this string quartet. There's something more approachable about it. So it's a friendly and open-featured cousin, even though the first and last movements bring us some of the most violent moments in Beethoven. And so the violent music, again, that would be more along the lines of uncompromising, the music that is less approachable or less pretty sounding, something along those lines.